At exactly 10 a.m. on December 11, 2025, inside the Coos County Superior Court in Lancaster, New Hampshire, Judge Peter Bornstein delivered a sentence that would echo through the rest of Dustin Duren's life. "You shot the unarmed mother of your 2 young children in the head," the judge said, his voice measured but heavy with the weight of what those words meant. "I'm going to repeat that. You shot the unarmed mother of your 2 young children in the head. 45 years to life in prison." That's what the judge imposed for the murder of Caitlyn Naffziger, 31, who died on February 29, 2024. A leap day that would forever mark a family's worst nightmare. But to understand how a former Marine, a father of 2 young daughters, came to stand in that courtroom convicted of second-degree murder, we need to go back to that February night in Berlin, New Hampshire, and to the 3 words a 4-year-old girl spoke that would haunt everyone who heard them. "Daddy went pew-pew." If you're drawn to cases that explore the devastating intersection of domestic violence, parental rights, and the systems meant to protect children, like, share, subscribe now, and hit the notification. This channel digs deeper than headlines into the complex truth behind true crime. Dustin Mark Duren, 38 years old at sentencing, had served his country as a Marine. He'd been deployed to Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, Iraq, and Kuwait. He'd been honorably discharged as a sergeant in 2011, carrying with him the invisible wounds of service that would later be diagnosed as PTSD. He'd come to New Hampshire seeking a fresh start, drawn by the Free State Project, a libertarian movement encouraging people to relocate to New Hampshire to influence local governance. He met Caitlyn Naffziger in 2019, and by all accounts, there was initial happiness. She became pregnant in April of that year, and their first daughter, Elowin, was born on December 2, 2019. A second daughter, Valen, followed. Duren taught Caitlyn to shoot a pistol for safety. They were a family, navigating the challenges of parenthood together, trying to build a life in New Hampshire's North Country. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Money problems, custody fears, arguments that escalated. Duren's mental health had deteriorated significantly in 2018, leading to a suicide attempt. The trauma of military service, inadequately addressed, festered. And on February 29, 2024, all of those tensions exploded in a small apartment at 1063 Main Street in Berlin with fatal consequences. Caitlyn sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, unarmed and vulnerable. Her 4-year-old daughter Elowin was nearby. And then Dustin Duren raised a pistol and fired a single shot into the left side of Caitlyn's head. The bullet traveled through her skull and brain before exiting above her right ear. She died almost instantly, her body slumping on the couch as her daughter processed what she'd just witnessed. "Daddy went pew-pew," Elowin would tell her aunt within minutes of the shooting. "Daddy didn't like Mommy anymore. Did my daddy like you? I knew if Daddy didn't like you, he would kill you." 4 years old. And already understanding that her father had killed her mother because he didn't like her anymore. The psychological damage of that moment, of witnessing your mother's execution, of understanding that your father was capable of such violence, is incalculable. Therapists who work with traumatized children will tell you that some wounds never fully heal, that the brain of a 4-year-old exposed to such horror is forever altered. But Elowin and her 1-year-old sister Valen weren't safe yet. After killing Caitlyn, Duren packed clothes for the girls, loaded them into his white Subaru, and fled. He didn't call for help. He didn't explain what had happened. He simply ran, driving through the night with 2 small children who'd just lost their mother, heading south through New Hampshire with no clear destination. By 10:30 p.m. on February 29, 2024, Berlin police responded to reports of a domestic disturbance at the Main Street apartment. They found Caitlyn Naffziger's body, the gunshot wound to her head leaving no doubt about what had happened. But Dustin Duren and the 2 children were gone. The police immediately recognized the danger. A man who just committed murder had taken 2 young children and was on the run. At 12:37 a.m. on March 1, 2024, New Hampshire State Police issued an Amber Alert. The messages blasted across the state, appearing on highway signs and cell phones. White Subaru Outback, license plate details, 2 young girls in danger. The entire state mobilized to find Elowyn and Valen before something terrible happened to them too. For hours, the search yielded nothing. Duren had a significant head start and could have been anywhere: Vermont, Massachusetts, Maine, even Canada. The girls' fate remained unknown. Their mother's family could only wait and pray and imagine the worst. Then, 170 miles south of Berlin, in the parking lot of an Applebee's restaurant in Keene, New Hampshire, a civilian spotted the vehicle. Carolyn Campbell and her daughter were driving when they saw the white Subaru that matched the Amber Alert description. "Here comes a white Subaru," Campbell's daughter said. "That's it. That's the car." Campbell called 911, and within minutes, police converged on the location. Body camera footage captured what happened next. Police approached with weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Open the door." With one hand, Duren complied. He was taken into custody without resistance, and the two girls were found unharmed in the vehicle, physically unharmed at least. The psychological harm was another matter entirely. 16 hours had passed since the shooting. 16 hours for Duren to drive through the night, to think about what he'd done, to craft whatever story he would tell police when the inevitable arrest came. And during those 16 hours, he never once mentioned self-defense or kidnapping or any of the claims he would later make at trial. The judge's words at sentencing would return to that central, undeniable fact. You shot the unarmed mother of your two young children in the head. No amount of PTSD, no custody disputes, no fear of kidnapping could justify that. Caitlyn Naffziger sat on a couch wrapped in a blanket when she died. She wasn't armed. She wasn't threatening anyone. She was simply sitting there when the father of her children decided to end her life in front of their 4-year-old daughter. 45 years to life. Duren will be 83 years old before he's even eligible for parole. His daughters, Elowyn and Valen, will have grown into adults, built their own lives, processed their trauma as best they can, all without their father. They'll also have to live with the knowledge that he killed their mother, that he chose violence over any other solution to whatever problems existed in that relationship. But before we can understand how the case unfolded in court, before we can grasp the full tragedy of what happened, we need to know who Caitlyn Naffziger was. We need to understand the life that was stolen on that February night, and the family that would be forever shattered by the sound of a single gunshot. Caitlyn Naffziger was 31 years old when she died, but the woman her family remembers was so much more than that number, so much more than the circumstances of her death. She was described as compassionate and nurturing, someone who prioritized her children's well-being above everything else. Being a mother wasn't just something Caitlyn did. It was who she was, the role that gave her life meaning and purpose. Born in 1993, Caitlyn came of age in an era of economic uncertainty and social media connectivity, navigating young adulthood with the same hopes and struggles as millions of her peers. She wanted stability for herself and her children. She wanted safety. She wanted a family built on love rather than fear. And for a time, she thought she might have found that with Dustin Duren. They met in 2019, at a point when both were looking for connection and possibility. Duren, a Marine veteran struggling with the transition to civilian life, presented himself as someone disciplined and capable, traits often associated with military service. Caitlyn saw potential in him, a man who'd served his country and now wanted to build a civilian life. Their relationship developed quickly, as many relationships do in the early stages when everything feels electric and possible. By April 2019, Caitlyn was pregnant with their first daughter. Elowyn arrived on December 2, 2019, a healthy baby girl who became the center of her parents' world. Those early months of parenthood are exhausting for any couple. Sleepless nights, constant needs, the adjustment to having a tiny human who depends entirely on you for survival. But they managed, learning together how to navigate the challenges of raising an infant. Caitlyn embraced motherhood with the intensity of someone who'd found her calling. She focused on Elowyn's development, her happiness, her safety. When Duren suggested teaching her to shoot a pistol for protection, Caitlyn agreed, not because she was particularly interested in firearms, but because she wanted to be able to defend herself and her daughter if needed. It seemed like a practical precaution for a family living in rural New Hampshire. A second daughter, Valen, followed. Now Caitlyn was managing two young children, navigating the chaos of toddlerhood and infancy simultaneously. Anyone who's raised multiple small children knows the physical and emotional exhaustion that comes with it. The constant demands, the lack of sleep, the feeling of never quite catching up. Caitlyn handled it with grace, even as the relationship with Duren began showing cracks. The move to New Hampshire had been influenced by Duren's interest in the Free State Project. The movement appealed to his libertarian beliefs, the idea of concentrating libertarian-minded people in one state to influence policy and governance. Berlin, a small city in New Hampshire's North Country, became their home. It was supposed to represent a fresh start, a place where they could build the life they both wanted. But fresh starts don't erase old problems, and Duren brought his struggles with him. His military service had left him with PTSD, a diagnosis he wouldn't receive until 2021 to 2022, years after the symptoms had already taken root. His mental health had deteriorated significantly in 2018, leading to a suicide attempt that should have been a red flag about his capacity to handle stress and conflict. Instead of receiving adequate treatment and support, he moved forward, carrying those unresolved traumas into a relationship and fatherhood. Money became a source of friction. Duren received $2,180 monthly in VA disability payments, with additional income bringing his total to around $2,380 per month. But their rent alone was $1,900, leaving precious little for everything else. Food, utilities, diapers, the endless expenses that come with raising two young children. The financial stress compounded the emotional stress, creating a pressure cooker environment in that small apartment on Main Street. Custody fears also plagued Duren, though the origins of these fears were murky. He would later claim that Caitlyn had threatened to take the children away, to falsely accuse him of kidnapping, to call the police and have them removed from his custody. Whether these threats were real or products of his paranoia is a matter of disputed testimony. What's clear is that Duren became increasingly obsessed with the idea that he might lose his daughters. Caitlyn's family would later testify about the woman they knew, not the person filtered through Duren's fears and accusations, but the actual human being who loved her daughters and tried to navigate an increasingly difficult relationship. They described someone gentle and caring, someone who'd never expressed any desire to deprive Duren of custody or harm the girls in any way. They described a woman who was, fundamentally, just trying to be a good mother in difficult circumstances. On February 29, 2024, Caitlyn's aunt, Brenda Plumondon, and another family member drove Caitlyn to meet Duren at the apartment. It was the last time they would see her alive. Within minutes of arriving at the apartment, Caitlyn would be dead. The family members who dropped her off would later torture themselves with questions. Should they have stayed? Should they have sensed something was wrong? Could they have prevented what was about to happen? But domestic violence is insidious precisely because it so often occurs in private, behind closed doors where no one else can intervene. Caitlyn walked into that apartment believing it was just another difficult conversation with her children's father. She probably expected an argument. They'd had plenty of those. Maybe she steeled herself for harsh words or accusations. But she almost certainly didn't expect to be murdered. She sat on the couch, wrapping a blanket around herself. Maybe she was cold. Maybe she was trying to make herself feel protected in an environment that was growing increasingly hostile. Elowyn was there, witnessing whatever interaction was unfolding between her parents. And then Duren retrieved a gun, the same gun he'd taught Caitlyn to shoot for protection, and pointed it at the mother of his children. Did she have time to be afraid? Did she see it coming? Did she try to plead with him or protect Elowyn or understand what was happening? We'll never know her final thoughts or feelings. We only know that a bullet entered the left side of her head, traveled through her brain, and exited above her right ear. We know that the autopsy found no markers of close-range firing, no soot, no muzzle imprints, no gunpowder stippling. The medical examiner estimated the gun was fired from at least 3 feet away. 3 feet. He wasn't in a struggle with her. He wasn't defending himself from an immediate threat. He stood at least 3 feet away, raised a pistol, aimed at her head, and pulled the trigger. It was an execution, plain and simple. Caitlyn Naffziger died on February 29, 2024, in an apartment in Berlin, New Hampshire, killed by the father of her children while one of those children watched. She was 31 years old, with decades of life stolen from her. She would never see Elowyn and Valen grow up, never help them with homework or navigate teenage heartbreak or celebrate their graduations. She would never become the grandmother she might have been, never have the chance to build the life she'd imagined when she first held her newborn daughters. Instead, she became a statistic, another woman killed by a current or former intimate partner, another mother whose children would grow up without her, another name added to the long list of domestic violence victims whose deaths might have been prevented if the systems designed to protect them had worked better. And somewhere in New Hampshire, two young girls, Elowyn and Valen, would have to grow up knowing that their father killed their mother, processing that trauma in ways that would shape the rest of their lives. Leap Day, February 29th, only comes once every 4 years, an extra day added to correct the drift between the calendar and Earth's orbit around the sun. It's supposed to be a quirk of timekeeping, a mathematical correction that most people barely notice. But for Caitlyn Naffziger's family, February 29th would forever be seared into their memory as the day everything shattered. The evening started ordinarily enough. Caitlyn's Aunt Brenda Plamondon and another family member picked her up to drive her to the Main Street apartment where Dustin Duren lived with their daughters. Perhaps Caitlyn had been staying elsewhere, with family, with friends, somewhere that felt safer than the increasingly tense atmosphere with Duren. Or perhaps this was simply a visit to see the girls and discuss ongoing custody arrangements. The exact circumstances of why she needed a ride remain unclear, but what's certain is that she arrived at that apartment around 10 p.m. Plamondon and the other family member drove away, assuming Caitlyn would be safe. Why wouldn't they? Despite whatever problems existed in the relationship, Duren was the father of Caitlyn's children. They'd been together for years. They had a history. The idea that he might kill her within minutes of her arrival seemed unthinkable. The kind of thing that happens to other people in news stories, not to your own family members. Inside the apartment, tensions escalated quickly. According to Duren's later testimony that shifted and changed as the legal process unfolded, they'd been fighting about money and taxes in the days leading up to February 29th. He claimed Caitlyn had threatened to falsely accuse him of kidnapping Elowyn, threatened to call police and have both daughters taken away. He claimed she was planning to flee with the children, to deny him custody, to destroy his relationship with his daughters. These claims would become central to his self-defense argument at trial. But on the night of February 29th, when he first encountered police after his arrest, Duren never mentioned kidnapping. He never mentioned self-defense. He never claimed Caitlyn posed any threat to him or the children. Those details would only emerge later, much later, after he'd had 16 hours to drive through the night and craft a narrative that might justify what he'd done. What actually happened in that apartment, stripped of the justifications and rationalizations that would come later, was this. Caitlyn sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Elowyn was present, her 4-year-old mind processing whatever interaction was unfolding between her parents. The apartment was small, less than 1,000 square feet, so there was nowhere private for adult conversations, no way to shield the children from whatever conflict was brewing. At some point, Duren retrieved his pistol. Maybe he'd been carrying it. Maybe he went to get it. But he ended up standing at least 3 feet away from Caitlyn. The medical examiner would be definitive about this based on the absence of close-range firing markers, with a loaded firearm aimed at the mother of his children. Caitlyn was unarmed. This fact cannot be emphasized enough because it demolishes any claim of self-defense. She had no weapon. She wasn't charging at Duren. She wasn't reaching for something that could be construed as threatening. She was sitting on a couch, wrapped in a blanket, when Duren pulled the trigger. The bullet entered above her left ear, traveling through her skull and brain before exiting above her right ear. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. Her brain simply stopped functioning the moment that bullet tore through it. She likely didn't have time to process what was happening, didn't have time to feel fear or pain or comprehend that her life was ending. Small mercies in a profoundly unmerciful situation. But Elowyn had time to process it. A 4-year-old girl watched her father shoot her mother in the head. The psychological term for this kind of trauma is adverse childhood experience. But that clinical language fails to capture the horror of what Elowyn witnessed. She saw her mother's body slump on the couch. She saw the blood. She understood, in whatever way a 4-year-old can understand such things, that her mother was dead and her father had killed her. "Daddy went pew-pew," she would tell her aunt. "Daddy didn't like Mommy anymore." The simplicity of that 4-year-old explanation somehow makes it more devastating. She didn't have sophisticated language to describe what she'd seen. She couldn't explain the mechanics of a gunshot or the permanence of death. She just knew that Daddy had made a sound, pew-pew, and Mommy wasn't moving anymore. And the reason was that Daddy didn't like Mommy. After the shooting, Duren faced a choice. He could call 911, attempt CPR even though it was clearly too late, tell police what had happened and claim self-defense in the immediate aftermath. Or he could run. He chose to run. He packed clothes for Elowin and Valen. He loaded them into his white Subaru Outback. He left Caitlyn's body on the couch, didn't call for help, didn't notify anyone about what had occurred. He simply fled with 2 traumatized children, driving south through New Hampshire in the darkness. What was he thinking during those hours behind the wheel? Was he planning to disappear permanently, to create new identities and vanish into some corner of America where he'd never be found? Was he contemplating suicide, taking himself and possibly the girls out of the equation entirely? Or was he simply in shock, moving on autopilot without any coherent plan beyond putting distance between himself and the crime scene? Valen, at 1 year old, was too young to understand what had happened. She sat in her car seat, probably confused about why they were driving in the middle of the night, why Mommy wasn't there, why her sister seemed distressed. But Elowin knew. Elowin had seen everything. And for hours, she sat in that car with the knowledge that her father had killed her mother. Back at the Main Street apartment, nobody yet knew what had transpired. Caitlyn's family went to bed that night assuming she was safely at the apartment, maybe having a difficult conversation with Duren, but fundamentally okay. The police hadn't been notified. No neighbors had reported hearing a gunshot. Apartments have thin walls, but a single gunshot in the evening might be dismissed as a car backfiring or some other innocuous sound. It wasn't until 10:30 p.m. that police received a call about a possible domestic disturbance at 1063 Main Street. The details of who called and why aren't publicly clear, but when officers arrived, they found Caitlyn Naffziger dead on the couch with a gunshot wound to her head. The scene spoke for itself. This was a homicide, and Dustin Duren, along with both children, was gone. As we continue, like, share, subscribe now, and hit the notification. At 12:37 a.m. on March 1st, 2024, cell phones across New Hampshire erupted with an alert that jolted thousands of people awake. The harsh, insistent sound that accompanies Amber Alerts, designed specifically to be impossible to ignore, blared from nightstands and living rooms and cars. Residents grabbed their phones to see what emergency had triggered the alarm. Amber Alert. 2 children missing. Elowin Duren, 4 years old. Valen Duren, 1 year old. Suspect, Dustin Mark Duren, 37. Vehicle white Subaru Outback. License plate provided. Consider suspect armed and dangerous. Mother found deceased. That last detail, mother found deceased, transformed the alert from concerning to terrifying. This wasn't a custody dispute where a non-custodial parent had taken children. This was a murder suspect on the run with 2 small children whose mother had just been killed. The possibilities of what might happen next were all horrifying. Law enforcement agencies across New Hampshire mobilized immediately. State police coordinated with local departments. Highway patrol officers watched every major road. The New Hampshire-Vermont border, the New Hampshire-Maine border, the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border, all were being monitored for a white Subaru Outback matching the description. If Duren tried to leave the state, they wanted to intercept him. But where was he going? That was the critical question that nobody could answer. He had a 2-hour head start before the Amber Alert was issued. He could have driven 100 miles in any direction by the time the alert went out. Vermont, Massachusetts, Maine, even Canada wasn't out of reach if he was willing to risk a border crossing. The alert reached civilians as well as law enforcement. Thousands of New Hampshire residents found themselves part of an impromptu search party, instructed to watch for a specific vehicle and call police if they spotted it. Some people went back to sleep after reading the alert. Others stayed awake, unnerved by the knowledge that somewhere in their state, a man who just killed his children's mother was driving through the darkness with those same children in his vehicle. Caitlyn's family learned about the Amber Alert and faced a new layer of horror. Not only was Caitlyn dead, murdered in that apartment where she'd been dropped off just hours earlier, but now Elowyn and Valen were missing with the man who'd killed their mother. The family knew Duren was capable of violence. They'd just seen the evidence of that. What else might he be capable of? The worst-case scenarios played through everyone's minds. Murder-suicide. Duren might decide that if he couldn't have his daughters, nobody could, and kill them before taking his own life. It happened more often than most people realized. Fathers who killed their children as a final act of control or revenge against the mother. Or he might simply disappear, vanishing into rural America with 2 children who'd be raised under false identities, never knowing their real names or what had happened to their mother. Hours passed. 1 a.m. became 2 a.m. became 3 a.m. The Amber Alert remained active, continuing to blast across cell phones periodically to ensure people stayed vigilant. Highway message boards displayed the vehicle description and license plate. News outlets picked up the story, running it on early morning broadcasts. 2 New Hampshire children missing after mother found dead. The story spread beyond state borders. Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine media were covering it too, just in case Duren had crossed state lines. Inside that Subaru, Duren drove through the night with his daughters. Elowyn, traumatized and confused. Valen, too young to understand but sensing that something was terribly wrong. Where was Mommy? Why were they driving in the dark? Where was Daddy taking them? Duren had 16 hours total between the shooting and his eventual arrest. 16 hours to drive, to think, to process what he'd done. And crucially, 16 hours to develop a story that might explain away the inexplicable. Because at some point during that drive, Duren must have realized he wasn't going to escape. The Amber Alert meant every police officer and thousands of civilians were watching for his vehicle. He couldn't hide indefinitely. He was going to be caught. So what story could he tell? What narrative could transform him from murderer to victim, from killer to someone acting in justified self-defense? During those 16 hours, as he drove through the darkness with 2 children who'd lost their mother, Duren began constructing the defense he would eventually present at trial. At approximately 5 a.m. on March 1st, about 6.5 hours after Caitlyn's body was discovered, Duren pulled into the parking lot of an Applebee's restaurant in Keene, New Hampshire. Why Keene? Why an Applebee's parking lot? Those questions would never be fully answered. Perhaps he was exhausted and needed to stop. Perhaps he was contemplating his next move. Perhaps he'd simply run out of ideas about where to go. Keene is roughly 170 miles south of Berlin. A significant distance, but not as far as he could have traveled in those hours if he'd been driving continuously. Maybe he'd taken a circuitous route, trying to throw off any potential pursuit. Or maybe he'd stopped somewhere else first before ending up in Keene. Whatever his reasoning, the Applebee's parking lot became the end of his flight. Carolyn Campbell and her daughter were driving in Keene when they spotted the white Subaru that matched the Amber Alert description. Campbell's daughter saw it first. "Here comes a white Subaru," she said. Campbell looked, compared it to the alert details, and immediately knew. "That's it. That's the car." She called 911. "I'm looking at the vehicle from the Amber Alert," she told the dispatcher, providing the location. Within minutes, multiple police units converged on the Applebee's parking lot. This was a high-risk situation, a murder suspect potentially armed with 2 small children in the vehicle. The officers had to balance the need to apprehend Duren with the imperative to keep the girls safe. Body camera footage captured the tense moments of the arrest. Police approached the vehicle with weapons drawn. "Police, show me your hands." The commands were sharp, authoritative, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Open the door with one hand." Slowly, Duren complied. He opened the door as instructed, kept his movements slow and controlled. He knew the situation he was in, surrounded by armed police, caught after fleeing from a murder scene, with his daughters in the vehicle. Any sudden movement could result in gunfire. He surrendered without resistance. Officers secured Duren, handcuffing him and placing him in a patrol vehicle. Then they turned their attention to the children. Elowyn and Valen were physically unharmed. Tired, confused, traumatized, but not injured. They were immediately taken into protective custody, beginning the process of being reunited with Caitlyn's family. The Amber Alert was cancelled at 5:42 a.m. Elowyn and Valen had been found safe. The suspect was in custody. But safe was a relative term. Yes, the girls were no longer in immediate physical danger. But they'd spent hours in a vehicle with the man who'd killed their mother. They'd been driven through the night, torn from everything familiar, caught in the middle of a nightmare from which they would never fully wake. Dustin Duren was transported to the Keene Police Department for processing and interrogation. And now, finally, he would have to explain what had happened in that apartment on Main Street. He would have to account for why Caitlyn Naffziger was dead, and he was 170 miles away with their children. The time for running was over. The time for reckoning had begun. The interrogation room at the Keene Police Department was small and sparse. A table, a few chairs, recording equipment to document everything that was about to be said. Dustin Duren sat across from investigators, knowing that whatever he said in this room would likely determine the rest of his life. He'd had 16 hours to think about this moment, 16 hours to prepare his explanation for why Caitlyn Naffziger was dead on a couch in Berlin. According to court documents, Duren admitted during his police interview to killing Naffziger. That admission alone would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. But the devil was in the details, specifically in what details Duren included and what he conspicuously omitted. In his initial statement to police on March 1, 2024, given just hours after his arrest in the Applebee's parking lot, Duren never mentioned kidnapping. He never claimed Caitlyn was trying to take the children away from him. He never said he acted in self-defense. He never suggested he'd shot her to protect Elowyn and Valen from being abducted. Those claims would only emerge later, much later, after he'd retained legal counsel and begun strategizing his defense. What did he say in that first interview? The exact transcript hasn't been made fully public, but prosecutors would later argue at trial that Duren's original statement to police bore little resemblance to the elaborate self-defense narrative he would present on the witness stand. This discrepancy between what he said immediately after the shooting and what he claimed at trial would become a crucial point in the prosecution's case. Dr. Mitchell Weinberg, the deputy chief medical examiner, conducted Caitlyn's autopsy and provided testimony that contradicted any claim of close-quarter struggle or immediate threat. He found two obvious defects in her head: an entry wound on the left side above her ear and an exit wound above her right ear. The bullet had traveled through her skull and brain in a trajectory that was nearly horizontal, consistent with someone shooting at a person seated or slightly reclined. More importantly, Dr. Weinberg found no markers of close-range firing. No soot deposits, no muzzle imprints, no gunpowder stippling. These markers appear when a firearm is discharged close to the target, typically within a few inches to 2 feet. Their absence meant the gun had been fired from at least 3 feet away, possibly more. This physical evidence demolished any suggestion that Duren had been in a struggle with Caitlyn when he pulled the trigger. 3 feet. Think about what that distance means. You can't accidentally shoot someone from 3 feet away during a tussle over a gun. You can't claim you were defending yourself from an immediate threat when you're standing 3 feet away from an unarmed person sitting on a couch. That distance represents a choice, a decision, a moment where Duren could have done anything else but instead chose to pull the trigger. The cause of death was straightforward: gunshot wound to the head. The manner of death was equally clear: homicide. Caitlyn Naffziger had been killed by another person, and that person was Dustin Duren. The medical evidence left no room for alternative interpretations. But Duren's defense team would eventually build a strategy around the concept of imperfect self-defense. The idea that even if Duren was wrong about the threat Caitlyn posed, if he genuinely believed she was about to kidnap the children, his perception of danger might reduce the charge from murder to something lesser. It was a legal Hail Mary, attempting to get inside Duren's head and argue that his distorted perception of reality somehow justified killing an unarmed woman. To understand how Duren arrived at this defense, we need to understand his background and the unaddressed traumas he carried. He'd enlisted in the Marines right out of high school, serving deployments to multiple countries including Iraq and Kuwait. He'd been exposed to combat situations, lived with the constant stress of military service in hostile territories, and returned home with wounds that weren't visible but were nonetheless real. He was honorably discharged as a sergeant in 2011, a rank that suggested competence and leadership. But his transition to civilian life was rocky. His mental health deteriorated significantly in 2018, leading to a suicide attempt that should have triggered intensive mental health intervention. Instead, he received a PTSD diagnosis years later in 2021 to 2022, long after the symptoms had already taken root and metastasized. PTSD can cause hypervigilance, paranoia, exaggerated threat perception. Someone suffering from untreated or inadequately treated PTSD might genuinely perceive threats that don't exist, might interpret neutral actions as hostile, might react with violence to situations that don't warrant such a response. This doesn't excuse violence. Millions of veterans manage PTSD without killing anyone, but it does provide context for how Duren might have convinced himself that Caitlyn posed a threat. According to his eventual trial testimony, the relationship with Caitlyn had been deteriorating for months. There had been an incident in Las Vegas where Caitlyn had allegedly taken Valen without his knowledge, which Duren characterized as kidnapping, even though Caitlyn, as the child's mother, had every legal right to take her daughter places. Duren's perception of that event, as kidnapping rather than normal parental behavior, suggested a distorted view of custody and control. He claimed they'd argued about money and taxes in the days before February 29th. He said Caitlyn had threatened to falsely accuse him of kidnapping Elowyn and call the police to have both children taken away. He said he'd developed a code word system with Elowyn so she could signal if she was in danger, a level of paranoia that suggested Duren was living in a state of heightened anxiety and perceived threat. But none of these claims appeared in his initial police interview. The kidnapping fears, the code words, the elaborate threat assessment, all of it emerged later, after he'd had time to construct a narrative that might mitigate his legal culpability. Prosecutors would hammer this point repeatedly. If Duren genuinely believed he was acting in self-defense, why didn't he say so immediately when police arrested him? The answer, prosecutors argued, was simple: because the self-defense claim was fabricated. Because Duren had 16 hours to drive through the night and realize he needed a better explanation than, "I shot her because I was angry." Because people who actually act in self-defense don't flee the scene, pack up their children, and drive 170 miles away. They call 911. They explain what happened. They cooperate with police because they have nothing to hide. Duren's flight undermined his entire defense before he'd even articulated that defense. Innocent people don't run. People acting in justified self-defense don't flee with their children and trigger Amber Alerts. The prosecution had all the evidence they needed to prove guilt. Duren's admission that he'd killed Caitlyn, the medical examiner's testimony about the distance and trajectory of the shot, the witness statements from Elowyn about "Daddy went pew-pew," and Duren's own behavior in fleeing rather than cooperating. But trials aren't always about what's true. They're about what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, what the jury believes, what narratives resonate with 12 ordinary citizens asked to make an extraordinary decision. Duren's defense team would have to convince those jurors that a Marine veteran with PTSD, operating under legitimate custody fears, might have genuinely believed he needed to shoot an unarmed woman sitting on his couch to protect his daughters. It was an uphill battle. But in the American legal system, everyone gets their day in court. Everyone gets to present their defense, no matter how implausible that defense might seem. Dustin Duren would get his chance to testify, to explain in his own words why he'd killed Caitlyn Naffziger. Whether anyone would believe him was another matter entirely. As we go further, like, share, subscribe now and hit the notification. October 2024. Nearly 20 months after Caitlyn Naffziger's murder, Dustin Duren finally faced a jury at the Coos County Superior Court in Berlin, New Hampshire. The trial would last 6 days, during which 12 ordinary citizens would hear testimony, examine evidence, and ultimately decide whether Duren was guilty of second-degree murder or whether his claims of self-defense had merit. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. Assistant Attorney Generals Bethany Durand and Joshua Spiker built their narrative around several unassailable facts. Caitlyn was unarmed, sitting on a couch when she was shot. The gun was fired from at least 3 feet away. Duren fled the scene rather than calling for help. And most devastatingly, Duren's 4-year-old daughter had immediately understood and articulated what happened. Daddy went pew-pew. Daddy didn't like mommy anymore. The prosecution called multiple witnesses. Brenda Plumond, Caitlyn's aunt, testified about dropping Caitlyn off at the apartment and learning within minutes that she'd been killed. Within minutes of their arrival, child said Daddy went pew-pew, said Daddy didn't like mommy anymore. Plumond recounted, her voice breaking, "Did my daddy like you? Knew if Daddy didn't like you, he would kill you." Hearing a 4-year-old's words repeated in a courtroom had a visceral impact. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Some dabbed at tears, because those simple words captured something that all the legal argumentation and expert testimony couldn't. A child's understanding that her father had killed her mother, and that the reason was as simple and terrible as him not liking her anymore. Dr. Mitchell Weinberg's testimony about the autopsy provided the medical foundation for the prosecution's case. He explained the trajectory of the bullet, the absence of close-range firing markers, the impossibility of this being anything other than an intentional shooting from several feet away. Defense attorneys tried to challenge his conclusions during cross-examination, but the physical evidence was irrefutable. Carolyn Campbell, the civilian who'd spotted Duren's vehicle in the Applebee's parking lot, testified about seeing the Amber Alert and recognizing the white Subaru. Her daughter had seen it first. "Here comes a white Subaru. That's it. That's the car." Campbell's 911 call had led directly to Duren's arrest and the recovery of the children. She'd been at the right place at the right time, and her quick thinking had potentially saved Elowyn and Valen from an uncertain fate. Body camera footage from the arrest played on screens throughout the courtroom. Jurors watched police approach with weapons drawn, heard the sharp commands, saw Duren comply and surrender. The footage was unremarkable in many ways, just a standard arrest procedure, but it provided important context. Duren hadn't resisted. He'd known he was caught. He'd surrendered peacefully, which suggested someone who understood the gravity of what he'd done. The prosecution also emphasized the timeline and Duren's changing story. In his initial police interview, hours after the shooting, Duren never mentioned kidnapping, never claimed self-defense, never suggested Caitlyn posed any threat to him or the children. Those claims only emerged later, much later, after he'd retained legal counsel and begun building a defense strategy. He had 16 hours, Prosecutor Durand told the jury during closing arguments. 16 hours to drive through the night, to think about what he'd done, to craft a story that might justify the unjustifiable. And when he finally spoke to police, did he mention kidnapping? No. Did he claim self-defense? No. Those details magically appeared later, after he'd had time to construct a narrative that might get him off the hook. Then came the defense's turn. Duren's attorneys faced an enormous challenge. Their client had admitted to killing Caitlyn Naffziger. They couldn't dispute that fundamental fact. So they pivoted to imperfect self-defense, the argument that even if Duren was wrong about the threat Caitlyn posed, if he genuinely believed she was about to kidnap the children, his actions might be understandable if not justified. The defense called their most important witness, Dustin Duren himself. It's always risky to put a defendant on the stand, especially in a murder trial. It opens them up to cross-examination, allows prosecutors to challenge their story directly, gives the jury an opportunity to judge their credibility face-to-face. But with no other viable strategy, the defense had little choice. Duren took the stand and told his story. He talked about his military service, his PTSD diagnosis, the suicide attempt in 2018 that illustrated his deteriorating mental health. He portrayed himself as a devoted father terrified of losing his daughters. He described the Las Vegas incident where Caitlyn had taken Valen, characterizing it as kidnapping, even though courts would likely see it as normal parental behavior. He claimed Caitlyn had threatened to falsely accuse him of kidnapping Elowyn, to call police and have both children taken away. He said he'd developed a code word system with Elowyn so she could signal if she was in danger. He portrayed himself as someone living in constant fear that his daughters would be stolen from him. And then he described February 29th. According to Duren, Caitlyn had arrived at the apartment and immediately tried to take Elowyn. He claimed she was planning to flee with the children that night, to disappear before he could stop her. He said he'd grabbed the gun to prevent the kidnapping, that he'd fired in defense of his daughters, that he'd acted out of fear and desperation rather than anger or malice. It was a compelling narrative if you believed it. A father pushed to extremes by custody fears, operating under the influence of untreated PTSD, making a tragic mistake in the heat of a moment he perceived as a kidnapping in progress. The defense attorneys hammered this theme. Duren wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. He was a traumatized veteran who'd made a terrible decision under psychological distress. But then came the cross-examination, and prosecutors systematically dismantled Duren's testimony. They confronted him with the medical evidence. If Caitlyn was trying to kidnap Elowyn, why was she sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket when she was shot? If there was an active kidnapping attempt, why did the autopsy show the gun was fired from at least 3 feet away rather than during a close struggle? They pressed him on the timeline. If he acted in self-defense, why did he immediately flee rather than call 911? Why did he pack clothes and drive 170 miles away if he just prevented a kidnapping? Why didn't he mention any of this in his initial police interview? They challenged his changing story. Mr. Duren, you never mentioned kidnapping to police on March 1st, did you? You never claimed self-defense in your initial statement, correct? These details only emerged a year and a half later at trial. Isn't that true? Duren struggled under the pressure. His answers became less certain, more defensive. The confident narrative he'd presented during direct examination began to crack under cross-examination scrutiny. Jurors watched closely, judging not just what he said but how he said it, whether his body language and demeanor suggested someone telling the truth or someone caught in a lie. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. You shot the unarmed mother of your 2 young children in the head, Duren said, her voice carrying across the courtroom. Caitlyn Naffziger was sitting on a couch, wrapped in a blanket. She had no weapon. She posed no threat. And the defendant stood at least 3 feet away, aimed a pistol at her head, and pulled the trigger. She paused, letting those words sink in. That's not self-defense. That's murder. The jury received the case after 6 days of testimony, expert analysis, and emotional arguments from both sides. Now 12 ordinary citizens had to decide, was Dustin Duren guilty of second-degree murder, or had he acted in defense of his daughters under a genuine, if mistaken, belief that Caitlyn was trying to kidnap them? Judge Peter Bornstein gave the jury their instructions, explaining the legal standards they needed to apply. For second-degree murder, the prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Duren either knowingly or recklessly caused Caitlyn's death. Knowingly meant he was aware that his conduct would cause her death. Recklessly meant he consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk that his conduct would cause her death. The judge also explained the concept of self-defense and imperfect self-defense, giving the jury the legal framework to evaluate Duren's claims. But he emphasized that self-defense requires a reasonable belief that deadly force was necessary. Standing 3 feet away from an unarmed person sitting on a couch didn't meet that standard. The jury filed out of the courtroom at approximately 2 p.m. and began their deliberations. In the courtroom, people settled in to wait. Caitlyn's family sat together, holding hands, praying for justice. Duren's family sat on the other side, hoping for mercy or acquittal or at least a reduced charge. The attorneys packed up their materials, knowing there was nothing more they could do. The case was now in the jury's hands. 2.5 hours. That's how long it took the jury to reach their verdict. In the context of a 6-day trial with complex testimony and emotional evidence, 2.5 hours was remarkably quick. It suggested the jurors hadn't agonized over their decision, hadn't been deeply divided, hadn't needed extensive discussion to reach consensus. At 4:30 p.m., the bailiff received word that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone was summoned back to the courtroom. The energy in the room was electric, anticipatory, terrifying. This was the moment that would determine Dustin Duren's fate and provide some measure of accountability for Caitlyn Naffziger's death. The jury filed back in, their faces revealing nothing. Judge Bornstein asked if they'd reached a verdict. The foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find?" "Guilty," The word hung in the air for a moment before its full impact registered. Caitlyn's family broke down in tears. Tears of relief, grief, vindication. They'd waited nearly 20 months for this moment. And finally, the man who'd killed their daughter and sister and niece had been held accountable. Duren's family wept as well, but their tears were of sorrow and loss as they processed that he would spend decades in prison. But the verdict wasn't finished. On the charge of reckless conduct with a deadly weapon, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of endangering the welfare of a child, how do you find? Guilty. 3 guilty verdicts. The jury had rejected Duren's self-defense claims entirely, finding instead that he'd knowingly and recklessly killed Caitlyn, that he'd acted with reckless disregard for safety by firing a weapon in the presence of children, and that he'd endangered Elowyn's welfare by exposing her to such violence. Judge Bornstein thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Sentencing would be scheduled for a later date, December 11, 2025. Duren was remanded to custody to await that sentencing, taken away in handcuffs as his family watched helplessly. Outside the courthouse, Attorney General John Formella spoke to media gathered for the verdict announcement. This verdict brings accountability for the tragic and senseless death of Caitlyn Naffziger, he said. We appreciate the jury's careful consideration and extend thanks to our entire trial team for their tireless work, as well as to the law enforcement officers from the New Hampshire State Police, Berlin Police Department, and Keene Police Department whose professionalism and dedication were critical to this investigation. Our thoughts remain with Caitlyn's family. Caitlyn's family released a statement through their attorney. We are grateful for the verdict and for the jury's recognition of the truth. Caitlyn was a loving mother who deserved so much better than what happened to her. While nothing can bring her back, we take some comfort in knowing that justice has been served. The 2.5-hour deliberation time spoke volumes about the strength of the prosecution's case. Jurors would later tell reporters, under condition of anonymity, that the medical evidence had been particularly compelling. The 3-foot distance between Duren and Caitlyn, combined with her being unarmed and sitting on the couch, made any claim of self-defense untenable. One juror said, if she'd been lunging at him with a weapon, maybe, but she was just sitting there. There was no threat. Others pointed to Duren's flight as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Innocent people don't run, one juror explained. If he really believed he'd acted in self-defense, he would have called police immediately and explained what happened. Instead, he packed up his kids and drove for hours. That tells you everything you need to know about whether he thought his actions were justified. Elowyn's words, "Daddy went pew-pew. Daddy didn't like mommy anymore," had also resonated powerfully with the jury. The simplicity of a 4-year-old's explanation, free from the complex legalese and competing narratives of the trial, captured the essential truth. Daddy had shot mommy because he was angry, not because he was defending anyone, but because he didn't like her anymore. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the criminal case, but it couldn't undo the damage. Caitlyn was still dead. Elowyn and Valen were still motherless. They would grow up knowing their father had killed their mother, processing that trauma through years of therapy and the painful work of building lives from the wreckage of February 29, 2024. And Dustin Duren would face decades in prison, his military service and aspirations for life in New Hampshire replaced by the reality of incarceration. He would watch his daughters grow up from behind bars, if they chose to maintain contact with him at all. He would live with the knowledge that he'd destroyed his family through a moment of violence that couldn't be undone or justified or explained away. Now came the sentencing phase, where Judge Bornstein would determine exactly how long Duren would spend in prison. The prosecution would argue for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime and the need to protect society. The defense would plead for leniency, citing Duren's military service, his PTSD, and his potential for rehabilitation. And ultimately, the judge would have to balance these competing considerations and impose a sentence that reflected both the gravity of the crime and the complexities of the man who'd committed it. December 11, 2025 would bring that final chapter. The same day as it happened that Harold Wayne Nichols was executed in Tennessee for his 1988 crimes. 2 different cases, 2 different outcomes, but the same fundamental questions about justice, accountability, and what society owes to victims and perpetrators alike. December 11, 2025. The courtroom at Coos County Superior Court filled with the same faces that had been there throughout the trial. Caitlyn's family seeking final justice, Duren's family hoping for mercy, court officials and media preparing to document the conclusion of a case that had gripped New Hampshire for nearly 2 years. Dustin Duren stood before Judge Peter Bornstein for sentencing, knowing that the words spoken in the next hour would determine when, if ever, he might experience freedom again. The guilty verdicts were already entered. The only question now was the length of his punishment. The prosecution presented their sentencing recommendation first. They argued for 50 years to life, a sentence that would ensure Duren spent the vast majority, if not all, of his remaining years in prison. Assistant Attorney General Bethany Durand emphasized the brutality of the crime, the fact that Caitlyn was unarmed and posed no threat, and the trauma inflicted on Elowin who'd witnessed her mother's execution. The defendant shot the mother of his children in the head while one of those children watched, Durand told the court. He then fled with both children, triggering a statewide Amber Alert and putting those children through hours of terror and confusion. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated act of violence followed by calculated flight. The sentence should reflect the severity of these crimes. Caitlyn's family members were given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements. Her mother, Lori, spoke through tears about the daughter she'd lost and the grandchildren who would grow up without their mother. Caitlyn was the most loving, compassionate person I've ever known, she said. She lived for her daughters. Everything she did was for them. And now they have to grow up knowing their father killed her. That knowledge will shape the rest of their lives in ways we can't even begin to understand. She addressed Duren directly. You didn't just kill my daughter. You destroyed our entire family. You took away Elowin and Valen's mother. You traumatized them in ways that will never fully heal. And for what? Because you were angry? Because you couldn't control her? Because your ego mattered more than her life? Other family members spoke as well, painting a portrait of Caitlyn as she'd lived, not as a murder victim, but as a person who'd loved deeply, laughed freely, and devoted herself to motherhood. They wanted the court to see her humanity, to understand exactly what had been stolen on February 29, 2024. Then came the defense's turn. Duren's attorneys argued for 25 years to life, emphasizing his military service and PTSD as mitigating factors. We are all more than the worst thing we've done, one attorney said. Mr. Duren served his country honorably. He suffers from service-related PTSD that was inadequately treated. He made a terrible mistake in a moment of extreme psychological distress. While that doesn't excuse what happened, it should be considered in determining an appropriate sentence. The defense also argued that Duren needed to maintain some connection with his daughters, that a sentence allowing for the possibility of eventual release would give him hope and incentive to participate in rehabilitation programs. Finally, Duren himself was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He stood, visibly emotional, and addressed the court. He started by speaking directly to Caitlyn's mother. Lori, I have empathy for you, a loving mother and grandmother, he said, his voice breaking. There's no greater pain than losing a child. I grieve for you and with you. Whether these words brought any comfort to Lori is doubtful. Hearing the man who'd killed your daughter express empathy while refusing to take full responsibility for his actions likely felt more like an insult than an apology. Duren continued, asking the judge to minimize his sentence so he could maintain contact with his daughters. Then he addressed Elowin and Valen directly, even though they weren't present in the courtroom. Love and stick together, he said. Even separated by distance, we'll always be together. Those words, even separated by distance, revealed that Duren understood he'd be physically separated from his daughters for a very long time. Whether they would choose to maintain any relationship with him, whether they would visit him in prison or even acknowledge his existence once they were old enough to make those decisions themselves, remained uncertain. Many children of incarcerated parents, especially those whose parents committed violence against their other parent, choose to sever all contact. Judge Bornstein listened to all of this, the prosecution's arguments, the victim impact statements, the defense's pleas for mercy, Duren's own words, and then began delivering his sentencing decision. His voice was measured but firm, carrying the weight of someone who understood the gravity of what he was about to pronounce. "Mr. Duren," the judge began, "you shot the unarmed mother of your 2 young children in the head." He paused, letting those words sink in before repeating them. "I'm going to repeat that. You shot the unarmed mother of your 2 young children in the head." The judge acknowledged the competing factors he had to consider. Duren's military service and PTSD diagnosis deserved consideration, as did the arguments about rehabilitation. But those factors had to be balanced against the nature of the crime, the need for general deterrence, and the domestic violence component that couldn't be ignored. With respect to general deterrence, Judge Bornstein explained, "The message that the taking of another life carries with it in this state and in this county is that there must be a prospect of severe punishment. There is also a domestic violence component to this case which has been discussed and cannot be ignored." Then he pronounced the sentence, 45 years to life in prison. Not the 50 years the prosecution had requested, but not the 25 years the defense had hoped for either. A sentence that acknowledged both the severity of Duren's crimes and some consideration of the mitigating factors his attorneys had presented. At 38 years old, Duren would be 83 before he was even eligible for parole. The judge noted that both the prosecution's and defense's proposed sentences included the possibility of earning time reductions through completion of programming, giving Duren some theoretical path to eventual release if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. But realistically, Dustin Duren will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Even if he's model prisoner, even if he completes every available program, even if he demonstrates profound remorse and transformation, parole boards are notoriously reluctant to release people convicted of murdering their intimate partners. The recidivism concerns, the public safety implications, the political pressures, all work against granting parole in domestic violence murder cases. Duren was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, beginning his journey into New Hampshire's prison system, where he'll spend the next several decades. His military service, his dreams of life in New Hampshire, his role as a father, all of it replaced by the reality of incarceration, the consequence of a moment of violence that destroyed multiple lives. Outside the courthouse, Caitlyn's family spoke to reporters. They expressed satisfaction with the sentence, believing it reflected the gravity of what Duren had done. 45 years to life means he won't be able to hurt anyone else, one family member said. It means our grandchildren are safe. And it means Caitlyn's death wasn't treated as something trivial or excusable. The family also spoke about their plans to care for Elowyn and Valen, to provide them with the stability and love they'd need to heal from the trauma they'd experienced. "These girls have been through hell," Lori said, "but they're strong just like their mother was. We're going to make sure they grow up knowing how much Caitlyn loved them, and that what happened wasn't their fault." The question of whether the girls would maintain contact with Duren remained open. Some children of incarcerated parents benefit from maintaining that relationship, having the opportunity to process their complex feelings with the parent who harmed them. Others find peace only through complete separation, cutting ties with a parent whose actions were too destructive to forgive. Elowyn and Valen would have to make those decisions for themselves as they grew older, with the support of family and therapists. Dustin Duren's case joins the long, tragic list of domestic violence murders. Intimate partners killed by people who claim to love them, children traumatized by witnessing violence between their parents, families shattered by preventable deaths. Every year in America, intimate partner violence claims thousands of lives. Caitlyn Naffziger became one more statistic in 2024, her death a reminder that domestic violence isn't always about punches and bruises. Sometimes it's a single gunshot, a moment of rage or control or distorted perception that ends a life and destroys a family. The sentencing on December 11, 2025, brought legal closure to the case. The criminal justice system had processed Dustin Duren, found him guilty, and imposed punishment. But for Elowyn and Valen, for Caitlyn's mother and family, for everyone touched by this tragedy, there is no closure. There's only the ongoing work of learning to live with loss, of processing trauma, of building lives around the permanent absence of someone who should still be here. Caitlyn Naffziger, 1993 to 2024, 31 years of life, a devoted mother, a compassionate person, forever remembered by those who loved her, and forever mourned for the life she didn't get to live and the daughters she didn't get to raise. And somewhere in a New Hampshire prison, Dustin Duren begins counting the days of a sentence that will likely last the rest of his life, separated by distance from the daughters he claimed he killed their mother to protect. I'll see you in the next case. Stay safe, stay aware,